morning, everyone. I'm Sarah from Sourdough for Beginners. I'm still a little sick. I just did a live a couple of days ago and said, I'm a little sick, bear with me. I still have a cough and everything else. But I'm here, I'm mixing, and so I thought I would go live because I'm going to do my mix a little bit differently today than I usually do. So normally with the beginner bread recipe, we are saying, that you should use probably 80% of a basic flour, like all-purpose or a bread flour. We often say that mixing with sturdy, heavy grains like whole wheat, spelt, rye, einkorn are different. They act a little bit differently. So I like to just every once in a while do one of these loaves with the very high sturdy wheat content, just to show you how they act slightly differently than regular all-purpose or bread flour. They tend to absorb more flour, so you probably should increase your hydration. They also tend to rise a lot faster, but otherwise the normal essential processes can be used. Excuse me. So I'm going to make a single loaf today, and I'm going to use the level 2 hydration beginner bread recipe, but I'm probably going to increase that water just a little bit. So the level 2 hydration for a single loaf calls for 100 grams of starter. So here's my starter, nice and active and bubbly, doubled up, ready to go. So I'm just going to dump 100 grams of starter into my bowl here. Now, usually the level 2 hydration would call for 350 grams of water, which is 70% of the 500 grams of flour, but I'm actually going to go to 375 grams of water today, which 350, 750, that's going to put us up to 75%. And the reason I'm going to do that is because the heavier whole wheat flours are going to soak up more water, and I think they just need it in order to support them. So we talk a lot about hydration when we are teaching about sourdough, and a lot of people are saying, what's hydration? I don't understand. Explain it to me. And basically what hydration is the percentage of water or the amount of water as a percentage of the total flour that you use. So if you're using 1,000 grams of flour and you've got 700 grams of water, that's a 70% hydration loaf. In most cases, basic flours like all-purpose flour, bread flour, they can only absorb up to somewhere between 70 and 75% water. When you start getting into sturdier flours like whole wheat, spelt, einkorn, whatever it may be, they actually have the ability to absorb more water. They haven't been processed as much, right? So that's when you can start going up to hydration levels of 80, 85, 90%. So when we start beginners out, when we're first starting to teach beginners, and we're saying, okay, start with the beginner bread recipe. It's low hydration, it's 68% hydration, and it's high white flour content. We always say to people, look, wheat flour or sturdy wheat recipes are just a little bit more complicated, and you absolutely should get there, but first get comfortable with the processes. So we suggest that they don't go above 20% of their sturdier flour at first. But assuming that you've been following along with the page and you've been here for a while and you're ready to start advancing those skills, then this is what you would do. So I've got 100 grams of starter and 375 grams of water in here. And now I need 500 grams of flour. So I've got this really nice organic spelt ancient grains flours from Bob's Bread Mill, and it's low. So I'm just going to use up what's left in here. Let's see how much that gives us. So that's about 128 grams. And now I've got my just sort of all-purpose but whole wheat flour. I'm just going to dump that in. What's the protein at? So we're just going to try and get ourselves up to, let's say, 500. Okay. So I've got 500 grams of the wheat flour, and then I've got 375 grams of water and 100 grams of starter, and now I'm going to add 10 grams of salt. Morgan says, hi, for market prepping, what do you think about making them early and freezing, thaw right before, and re-crisp crust? Thoughts? Worried I won't have enough time the days before. So That's called par baking, and there's a lot of people who do it. So basically what they do is they cook it to 90%. They freeze it, and then they pull it out and they let it thaw, and then they put it in the oven and cook it the last 10%, just to make sure it comes up to 205 Fahrenheit. So definitely lots of people do that. Okay. So here we go. So what's going to happen with this wheat flour mix during the day is that, number one, as I'm mixing here, it's likely going to absorb the water much faster and much more dramatically than it would if we were just using an all-purpose flour. But during the day, this loaf is actually going to bulk proof much faster than my regular all-purpose flour loaves would. So I want to keep an eye on it. I really want to make sure that I'm doing a very good bulk proof and staying very present with this bread, because it's not something that I do often. So everything gets easier with practice and when you're really comfortable with something, right? But if you're doing something that you don't do very often or that's very new to you, with sourdough, I always suggest that you try to mix in the morning and watch the dough during the day. So because this is 100% whole wheat, 100% sturdy flour. Good morning, everyone. Oh, Morgan says, thank you so much. That makes me feel much less stressed. Yes, never be stressed about sourdough. And I see lots of people sending happy faces and likes and everything else. Thanks, guys. I'm glad you're there. I was just saying at the beginning of this live, I've got a little bit of a cold, a little bit under the weather. Okay, so I mixed this up. Now, as you can see, it's quite shaggy, right? It's entirely different to work with a sturdy flour than it is to work with all-purpose flour. It just is. The flour is at a different point in its... it hasn't been processed as much as the white flour has, right? And so it still has the ability to absorb a lot of water, whereas the all-purpose flour and the bread flour, which have been processed down, don't have as much ability. So when you're working with pure whole wheat flours, it's much stickier later in the process. So if you've watched any of my lives before, you've seen me use my hand to mix up the all-purpose flour with the water. Proof's a lot faster with wheat. That's what I've noticed. Right, Jessica, that's what I'm talking about. And so we want to make sure that if we're still in the beginner phases and it's our first time ever using a whole wheat flour or a very sturdy flour like spelt or rye, we can even use oat in our bread, whatever it may be, that we're really going to pay attention to the dough, because it's going to act entirely differently than it would if you were using bread or all-purpose flour. So as you can see here, if you've watched any of my other lives before, when I mix early on, the dough really sticks to my hands a lot. And then I always explain how as we stretch and fold, we build strength, right? And as we continue through that stretching and folding process, we find that the dough begins to stick less and less to our hands, because it's starting to stick more and more to itself. And that's what the purpose of stretching and folding is. What I find with a heavy wheat mix is that it doesn't actually stick to my hands as much as the all-purpose flour does at first. But later, during the shaping phase, after the bulk proofing phase, it tends to be much, much stickier with the pre-shaping and shaping for this. So what I've done with this dough is I've mixed it up to a shaggy dough. I'm just going to rinse my hand. I'm going to go through the same exact process that we always teach on this page. So if you're new to the page and you haven't seen any of the lives before, we teach what we call the essential processes. And so what we're saying is, hey, let's get this making of sourdough simplified down to just your most basic things that we would like to see people do in order to get good bread every time. What we think you really need to be able to go in and do the same thing over and over again every single day and get a perfect loaf of bread every single time. And then once you've mastered those essential processes, we start helping you move forward and advance to where you want to be. So the beginner bread recipe is a low hydration, 68%, easy to manage, easy to use recipe. The way it's set up is you feed your starter before bed, you mix early in the morning, you stretch and fold, so 30 minutes rest, stretch and fold, times 4. So usually takes about 2 hours to get through the initial mix and the stretching and folding phase. Then we get our dough into clear, straight-sided containers like this. We mark the height of our dough. We watch it while it bulk proofs. We always say that bulk proofing should take somewhere between 4 and 8 hours. With my wheat loaves, I have actually seen them in the past double almost in like 3.5 hours. So the whole wheat flour will go much faster. After bulk proofing, we start preheating our oven. We pre-shape our dough. We let it rest for a little bit, half an hour or so. Then we put our final shape on, score our dough, bake it right away the same day. What we've done is we've said cold proofing is optional. It's something you absolutely should do, but maybe not at first. Because if you've already made a mistake earlier in the day, then cold proofing is just going to make it worse. We say, you know, creating an auto lease or a levain from your starter, or adding your salt later. These things are all processes that do have a purpose, but they're a little bit more complicated and advanced than a beginner might need. And then we always say that using sturdy grains like whole wheat, spelt, and rye make the bread more difficult. So maybe at first, just add 20% of that sturdy grain and then get comfortable with how the dough feels and work up. So that's what we're looking at today, is how do we do 100% whole wheat. What about grinding up like lentils or split peas to flour and using part of it in the all-purpose flour? I'm curious if that will work. Jessica, I'll try and find a link for you. I did a loaf a few weeks back that was 100% whole wheat, but I used up all of the rest of the steel cut oats that I had in one container. And then in another container, I had this like oat blend. I think it had quinoa, regular sort of quick oats. There was maybe some flax, like there was a bunch of stuff in there, and it turned out beautifully. I think that you need to have like a certain volume of wheat flour in order to get through the process. I don't really know how to do gluten-free, but adding those things into your flour as part of the total volume, I think that's great. I think you absolutely can do that. So while we're waiting, I'll do my first stretch and fold on this little loaf soon. If you're still here, then you'll be able to see it. But I'm just going to refeed this starter. So if you are new to the game, if you're just watching this and you've never actually made any sourdough before, then this is what we call our starter. So it's an active and alive fermented mix of flour and water, and it needs to be fed one way or another, more flour and water within certain periods of time in order to keep it alive. Depending on how you are, how you're managing your starter, there's different things that you could do. If you have an established starter, it's an entirely different management program than if you are building a starter. So if you're building a starter, go to the description of this video, start at the top, go to the full visual starter day by day, go through the starter playlist. Getting a starter to activate is different than maintaining a starter. So I'm just going to chat quickly about maintaining a starter. My process is I mix my bread and then I feed my starter right after. I let it double on the counter and then I plunk it in the fridge, and usually I'll bake within a day or two. So I will actually pull it straight out of the fridge and bake with it, even though it's been sitting there for a day or two. I do like a little bit more sour flavor in my bread, and the fridge basically stops the fermentation, not entirely, but slows it down enough that the starter will stay up at peak for a day or two. If I find that I'm much more than a day or two until I bake 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 days, then I'll actually pull the starter out, discard it, and feed it, wait for it to double, and use it. So the 3 most common ways to manage your starter after it's established. If you bake every day, keep it on the counter, feed it every time you use it, and, you know, it's always alive, it's always awake, it's always good to go. If you're baking once every 2 or 3 days, then you could feed it right after you mix, let it peak, stick it in the fridge, and then use it straight out of the fridge. If you're only baking about once a week or around once a week, then you can take your starter out, mix your dough, and then you can actually put the starter back in the fridge without feeding it, and then next time you're ready to bake, pull it out 4 to 12 hours before you bake and feed it then. So with mine, I'm just going to give it a quick little feed here. So I only used 100 grams of starter, so I'm just going to replace what I took out. So I'm going to put in 50 grams of flour, and with my starter I just use basic all-purpose flour. although a little bit of wheat doesn't necessarily hurt it, and sometimes I do. So let's try this. Let's put, let's say about 40 grams flour. There we go. And then we'll use up this, I dropped all this wheat here on the counter. We'll dump that in. We will grab a little bit of this wheat here, sprinkle it on. You can feed your starter whatever flour you like. At first, when you're first starting to develop a starter, when you're first learning about sourdough, it's probably a good idea to be accurate in your weight measurements and in how much you're using, mostly because that consistency allows you to troubleshoot where you might have gone wrong when an issue happens. But over time, once you're used to your sourdough and you've been using it for quite some time, you'll understand that it's really quite resilient. So it doesn't matter if you accidentally dump a couple grams too many of water in, or if you accidentally dump way too much in, you can just add more flour and give it a bigger feed that time. But like I said, if you're new to sourdough, then I suggest that you start at the top of the tutorials and work your way down. But this is for an established starter. So what I just did was I take what I usually feed the starter, which is all-purpose flour, and since I had the whole wheat sitting out on the counter today, I gave it a little bit of whole wheat. So my starter usually gets a little bit of whole wheat, say once a month, and it loves it. It'll just double and bubble and be super happy for the next several days. So just happened to be sitting here. So here we go. So it's, you know, not watery, not too thick. It's all good. I'm just gonna leave this sitting on the counter. Let's put my lid on. Tightly sealed lid camp, that's where we live. We believe that a tightly sealed lid is what will prevent mold and fruit flies, and with ours, as long as your jar is big enough, you won't have to worry about it popping, right? So right now I've got quite a lot of starter in my jar here. Right now I'm planning to do a big bake pretty soon. So I don't have a ton of room. So I will keep an eye on this because it might start to, you know, get super bubbly on top. But usually as long as your starter is in a big enough jar, you won't have to worry about popping. Oh, Carlene, thank you so much. Oh, I love those stars. They're so fun. I'm really glad you're here. If anyone's got any questions as we go, please do ask them. I'm happy to answer. So we've got our mix that we made, and I'm going to post the recipe for this in the comments so that it's there. And I'm probably also going to download this video and put it up on YouTube. But this is 100 grams of starter, 375 grams of water, 500 grams of sturdy whole wheat flour. In my case, it ended up being about 150 of spelt and 350 of all-purpose whole wheat, and 10 grams of salt. So it's, excuse me, it's essentially the same as the beginner bread recipe that we have, just with a higher water content and a slightly higher starter content, but it's all whole wheat, so it's going to act very differently. So we've talked about stretching and folding. So I'm just going to start. Now, if you look, when I start pulling at this, it will break, right? And the idea with stretching and folding is that we're trying to build strength, right? And so I think it's just important to note that if you've been practicing along and you've been getting used to the beginner bread recipe and now you're going to try wheat, it is going to act and feel different than what you're used to with all-purpose. On the other hand, if you're planning on just starting out with all whole wheat right from the get-go, we don't necessarily recommend that. But I mean, some people are like, well, I just don't eat white flour, so I have to do it right this way right from the get-go. Then just know that the dough is a little stickier and a little bit harder to work with, a little bit less forgiving. So I'm doing this first set of stretch and folds here, and you'll notice that the dough is still sticking quite a bit to my hands. And it will continue to be this way throughout the process. Whereas usually one of the things that I do in my lives or on my videos is I say, look, like even as I start stretching and folding, it's starting to get better. But if you look at this dough, it just looks stickier. So the point of this live was that I wanted to show you the basic recipe that you should use if you're considering doing an all whole wheat loaf for the first time. We do encourage you to still use the essential processes, still follow the same techniques that we've talked about, but just be prepared for the difference in feeling. Cindy says, my dough is always more wet than that. I do weigh my ingredients and I use bread flour. I just need to use more flour. It depends on what your recipe is. So if you're not having issues, Cindy, if your dough is coming out fine, and your bread is coming out fine and you're getting oven spring and it's not falling, then I wouldn't change anything. But if you are having problems, then review your recipe. We always recommend that beginners start with low hydration and very slowly work their way up. So for example, like I said, the beginner bread recipe, if we were going to do a double loaf, is 120 grams of starter, whereas the level 2 hydration is 200 grams of starter. So we increase the starter a little bit for the sort of level 2 recipe. The beginner bread recipe is 680 grams of water. The level 2 hydration is 700 grams of water. And then for this whole wheat one, I've actually gone to 750 grams of water if we were going to be doing a double loaf mix, which today I just did a single. So I'm going to post those down in the comments. But the reality is that the higher you go in your hydration, the harder it is to work with your dough. Once you get used to working with that dough, once you get used to how it's supposed to feel, how far it needs to go, how long it needs to bulk proof, and how it needs to be dealt with at the shaping phase, right? The pre-shaping phase starts to become really, really important with a very high hydration dough. Then you can start sort of working your way up. So what we've tried to do is set beginners up to go, to say, you know, like we have, we try to make it set up so that we can say, look, get used to these feelings, right? Get used to the feeling of getting up in the morning, doing your mix, how the stretch and fold feels on your hands. Get used to watching your bread bulk proof during the day in the clear, straight sided containers. Get used to what pre-shaping feels like with this sort of dense, low hydration dough. And then as you slowly increase that hydration, you'll start to feel the difference, but it won't be so dramatic, right? With this dough, later today, when I go to pre-shape it, it's going to be very sticky. Very, very sticky. But I'm used to that because I came up to it, right? And so that's what we're teaching with the beginner bread recipe. So if you've been watching and following along, then just check out the description. We've got like the beginner bread recipe first, all the way through the playlist, and you can actually see the evolution of how we would naturally teach the essential processes. So thanks for being here. Sorry about my wheezy chest and my cold. I've just been sick during this March break up here in Ontario with the weather changing, but I'm glad you're here. And if you've got any questions, post them in the comments. I'll go through and answer them. I'll get all of the information to you, and be sure to check out the YouTube channel where all of the full length uploaded tutorials are. We'll talk to you all again soon. Bye for now.